Imagine a working house in the north. Timber walls darkened by smoke, damp wool hanging near the fire, tools stacked where they can be grabbed quickly because the world outside does not give you time to search for what you need. The roof creaks under wind that feels personal, rain moves across the land like a thrown net, and the cold has its own timing, arriving early some years, staying late in others, with no interest in human plans. In that kind of landscape, the sky isn't background decoration, and weather isn't casual conversation. It is a force that enters the day and changes what is possible. A week of rain can sour grain in the field, a late frost can turn effort into waste, and a storm at sea can separate a community from the people it depends on. When life is built on wood that rots and iron that rusts, on animals that get sick and crops that fail, security becomes a thin word, almost an insult, because everyone knows how easily the world can lean the wrong way. Then thunder rolls across open ground, and it lands in the body before it lands in the mind. You feel it as pressure in the chest and vibration underfoot, and only after that do you hear it as sound, and only later do you explain it as weather. That order matters because it hints at the way thunder was experienced, as something present, moving, and enormous, the kind of presence that could frighten you and reassure you in the same moment. In the medieval Icelandic poems we call the Eddic tradition, Thor is deeply connected to that register of experience. He is remembered as weight and momentum, a force that arrives loudly, takes up space and pushes back. If we treat him as a distant concept, we miss what he is doing in the stories, because the stories don't keep him at a distance. They bring him close enough that you can almost hear the cart, almost smell wet earth after lightning, almost sense the relief of knowing that something strong is still moving out there. Thor belongs to a world where the line between survival and disaster is thin, and where strength isn't admired as a luxury, it is needed as a response. When people meet Thor in the old narratives, they rarely meet him in stillness. He is a traveler, a breaker of obstacles, a figure whose presence makes rooms feel smaller, and whose temper is as famous as his protection. The poems give him a physicality that borders on the comedic at times. He is enormous, red-bearded, easily provoked, yet that physicality is not there to make him shallow. It is there to make him immediate, because his function requires immediacy. Odin's power is often shown through distance, patience, and knowledge gathered by sacrifice, and the sources lean into that by surrounding him with riddles, disguises, and long shadows. Thor occupies a different kind of space. He is the god you imagine when you imagine the moment a threat becomes real and requires a direct answer. He is what you call when you want the border to hold, when you need the road to stay open, when you want the household to remain intact. That doesn't mean the tradition presents him as a simple hero who always wins. The sources are too honest for that, and the world they reflect is too harsh for easy triumph. Thor can be tricked, mocked, delayed, and forced into situations where sheer force cannot solve the puzzle, and those moments are not accidents. They are part of the myth's understanding of how life works. You can have strength and still meet things that refuse to move, or things that move in ways you cannot predict, and the measure of reliability becomes what happens next, whether you continue, whether you return to your role, whether you show up again tomorrow. He is not a fantasy of effortless dominance. He is a fantasy of presence that keeps returning, even when returning is costly. Thor's origins bind him tightly to the human world, and they do it through a genealogy that feels less like family drama and more like cosmology. His father is Odin, the sky-minded figure who travels far from comfort to gather knowledge, who bargains with powers beyond the familiar world, and who builds authority through what he is willing to endure. His mother is Jörð, meaning earth, whose name is as blunt as her meaning because she is ground itself, the soil that carries homes, graves, and crops. In the old genealogies, she also belongs to the giant world, which is one of the clearest reminders that gods and giants are not sealed-off species in this universe. They are rival powers whose bloodlines cross again and again. In that lineage, Thor becomes the collision of sky and land, and it is hard to think of a more direct mythic description of thunder. A violent meeting between above and below, between height and heaviness, between force and resistance. He inherits authority through Odin, but he inherits belonging through the earth, which is why his stories are rarely about withdrawing from the world. They are about engaging with it, pushing through it, holding it. The Eddic poems present him as quick to anger and quick to act because the role he plays is built for urgency. Thor's strength is not subtle and it isn't ornamental. It is designed to be used, expended, tested and relied upon, the way you rely on a tool that has to work when the day turns bad. For communities whose lives ran close to danger, a god anchored in the physical world could feel dependable in a way that purely mystical power did not. Thor's energy is the energy of labor, of protection, of the body set against the weather, and in that sense he becomes less like a distant king and more like the strongest member of the household, the one you trust to step outside first when something is wrong. Mjölnir, Thor's hammer, is one of the most recognizable symbols of the Norse mythic world, and that recognition can flatten it into a simple emblem of violence if we aren't careful. In the medieval tradition, especially in Snorri's prose retelling, which preserves and organizes older material in a distinctly Christian-era Icelandic context, the hammer's origin is tangled in mischief, craft, and the unpredictable consequences of divine games. Yet the meaning that grows around it is steady, almost practical, because the hammer becomes an instrument for maintaining a workable world. In stories where giants represent pressures that threaten the fragile spaces humans depend on, Mjolnir functions as a corrective. It does not simply destroy, it sets boundaries. It forces a return to a stable shape of things, pushing back what would overwhelm farms, roads, halls, and the small human zones where life can actually be lived. The detail that the hammer returns after it is thrown matters because it turns power into rhythm. In a culture built around repeating tasks, repairing, sowing, harvesting, rebuilding after storms, the idea of a weapon that always comes back carries a deeper reassurance than a single decisive victory. The hammer's return is the promise that the work continues, that the defender remains equipped, that the response will be there again the next time. It also helps explain why the hammer's symbolic life extends beyond battle. The medieval sources show Mjolnir associated with blessing and sanctifying, and the broader tradition remembers it as something tied to transitions, unions, oaths, the boundary between living and dead. Even when we treat those details cautiously, because our sources come through layers of time and retelling, the pattern is consistent enough to take seriously. Thor's power is imagined as protective and stabilizing, and the hammer becomes the sign of that stability. Archaeology adds a quiet but important echo here. Across Scandinavia, small hammer pendants appear in graves from the Viking Age, and their distribution suggests that this was not only a symbol of elite identity, but also something worn by ordinary people, close to the skin, as if protection were most meaningful when it was carried into work and travel, rather than displayed at a distance. Archaeology cannot tell us exactly what every wearer believed, but it can show us what was valued enough to be made, worn, and taken into death. Taken together, the literary tradition and the material record point in the same direction. Mjolnir is not merely an icon of striking, it is an icon of keeping things intact through effort, again and again, in a world that constantly tries to pull apart. Thor's stories unfold on roads and borders, which is another way the tradition keeps him close to ordinary experience. He is not primarily a god of temples and distant rituals. He is a god who moves through landscapes where people actually travel, through valleys, rivers, and thresholds where safety can change in an instant. In several tales, Thor travels with companions, and he rides in a chariot drawn by goats, animals tied to his motion so completely that the stories allow a strange logic of subsistence. The goats can be slaughtered for food and then restored, provided the bones are treated correctly. It is easy to read this detail as pure fantasy, yet it carries the emotional logic of a survival culture, where the line between use and loss is always being negotiated, and where renewal is the difference between hope and despair. Thor's movement is rarely comfortable. He meets hunger, he meets exhaustion. He arrives at halls where hospitality is a moral test, and he reacts to refusal with an anger that can feel excessive to modern ears, until you remember that hospitality was not merely politeness, it was a survival contract in a world where travelers could die between settlements. When the stories show Thor forcing entry or demanding accommodation, they are not only showing divine arrogance, they are dramatizing the seriousness of access and refuge in a harsh environment. Even his physical struggles, wading through rising waters, pushing forward when a river tries to sweep him away, place him inside the same economy of hardship as humans. The god of thunder is not floating above the landscape, he is moving through it, and the mythic energy comes from watching force meet resistance at the level where bodies actually fail. That is why Thor feels present rather than abstract. His mythic life is built from the textures of travel, the cold air, the wet ground, the uncertain doorway, the sense that the world beyond cultivated land is always waiting. Beyond the fields and farmsteads, the mythic world opens into spaces that are older, harsher, and less negotiable. Mountains, ice, endless stone, wilderness that does not care who you are. This is where the tradition places the giants, and it matters that they are not simply monsters in the modern sense. They represent something more elemental, the pressure that exists before order, the raw material of chaos, the ancient weight pressing against fragile human space. In the Norse mythic imagination, the world humans inhabit is not a natural default, it is a held position. It exists because boundaries are maintained. The giants occupy the place where those boundaries weaken, which is why the stories return again and again to the image of Thor meeting them at margins, not always to annihilate them forever, but to push them back, to keep the map from bleeding into itself. This framing also helps the myths avoid a simplistic moral picture. Giants can be enemies, but they can also be sources of power and knowledge. The gods themselves have complicated ties to them. That complexity is part of what makes Thor's role sharp. He becomes the one whose duty is less ambiguous. When the pressure surges, when the border is threatened, he moves toward the impact point. If you live in a world where the wilderness can swallow roads and winters can erase progress, the image of a defender whose job is to meet pressure with pressure takes on a particular emotional weight. Thor is not the promise that chaos can be erased. He is the promise that chaos can be held long enough for life to continue. One of the most charged images of Thor's function appears in the story of his fishing expedition for Jormungandr, the world serpent. Versions of this tale appear across the medieval record, including in Eddic poetry and later prose retellings, and the core idea remains consistent. Thor rows out into the deep beyond the comfort of shore, and he uses an ox's head as bait to hook a creature whose body encircles the world. The scene is built like a mythic pressure test. The horizon empties, the land disappears, the boat becomes a fragile thing in an indifferent sea, and the god of thunder is reduced for a moment to a fisherman's posture, hands on rope, body braced, waiting for the pull. Then the pull comes, and it is not the pull of an ordinary animal. The serpent rises, and the story stretches time in a way that feels almost cinematic. The rope tightens, the sea strains. Thor's body becomes a bridge between the human scale of a boat and the cosmic scale of a creature that defines the world's boundary. In some tellings, Thor nearly succeeds in killing Jormungandr, and in others, the moment breaks before it resolves, because an interruption releases the serpent back into the deep. What matters is the shape of the encounter rather than a simple win-loss outcome. The myth allows the confrontation, even demands it, but it also understands that some forces are not eliminated by one act of strength. They are met, contained, delayed, pushed back into darkness, and watched for the day they return. For an audience living with storms, hunger, and the constant need to rebuild, this is not a disappointing ending. It is a realistic one. You confront what you can. You hold what you can. You keep living in the space you have managed to preserve. Thor's mythic greatness lives in that holding. Eventually, the road carries Thor into a different kind of danger, one that does not meet him head-on. In the story preserved most clearly in Snorri's prose Edda, Thor and his companions reach the realm of Utgarda Loki, and the tone shifts in a way that is easy to miss if you treat the episode as light entertainment. The hall is calm, the welcome is polite, the challenges are presented as games, framed almost as hospitality itself, and the atmosphere suggests that nothing here needs to fear brute force. That is exactly what makes it unsettling. Thor is offered tests that align with his reputation, which means he is invited to perform his strength in public, under rules he did not set, in a place that feels safe enough to lower suspicion. A drinking contest that should be simple becomes impossible because the horn seems not to empty. A lifting contest becomes absurd because the creature he is asked to lift, a cat, feels heavy in a way that is difficult to describe without sounding like a dream. A wrestling match becomes quietly horrifying because the opponent is an old woman whose resistance does not behave like muscle, but like something colder and more enduring. Thor does not collapse. He does not beg. He strains, he pushes, he refuses to accept defeat easily. And that refusal is important because it shows that the story is not trying to humiliate him for comedy alone. It is using him as the instrument through which the audience can feel something larger, the realization that even force, even divine force, can be measured against structures that are not built to be moved. The revelation comes after the hall is left behind, when the deception is explained. The horn was connected to the sea itself, so Thor was drinking the ocean down. The cat was a disguised form of the world serpent, so lifting it meant attempting to raise the boundary of the world. The old woman was age, and age does not lose in a fair contest. What lingers in this story is not that Thor failed. What lingers is scale. Thor's strength remains real, but the world contains pressures that cannot be solved by strength alone, and the myth wants the listener to recognize that without giving up the comfort Thor provides. Because in real life, the existence of limits does not make strength meaningless. It makes it necessary, and it makes it costly. After Utgarda Loki's hall, the stories do not pause for philosophical reflection. They are not written as confessions or diaries, yet the shift is there, embedded in the way the tradition handles Thor's role. His task remains the same. The giants still press at the borders, the road still calls. The work of holding the world still needs doing. The difference is that the myth makes room for a mature understanding of what holding means. Strength operates inside limits. Effort does not abolish time. Courage does not prevent decay. You can be the strongest presence in the landscape and still meet age, weather, and fate as forces that do not yield. That is not a cynical message. It is an honest one, and honesty is one reason these myths stay powerful, even when the religion that produced them has long since changed. For people living with failed harvests, illness and loss that did not always come with a moral reason, a story that admits limits can feel more trustworthy than a story that promises final victory. The promise Thor offers is more grounded, the promise that when pressure gathers, something will answer it. The promise that the border can be held for another season, the promise that survival can be extended by presence, by force, by continued return. Thor continues because continuation is the job, and in that simple persistence he becomes one of the clearest symbols the Norse mythic world has for resilience without illusion. In the mythic future, the holding eventually ends. Ragnarök arrives as culmination rather than surprise, because the stories have been building tension all along, naming enemies that cannot be destroyed permanently and describing a world whose stability depends on constant maintenance. When the final breaking comes, it comes as release. Boundaries collapse, old threats come forward, and the structure that held the world in a workable shape begins to unravel. Thor moves toward the sound that defines him, and his final confrontation with Jormungandr is described with a grim clarity that feels very different from the trickery of Utgarda Loki's hall. There are no games here, no polite rules, no illusion of safety. This is the collision that has been waiting inside the tradition from the moment the serpent was first named. Thor kills Jormungandr, and the sources give him that victory without ambiguity, because the myth recognizes the necessity of the act. Then it takes the victory away from the audience's appetite for comfort, because victory does not cancel consequence. Poison spreads. Thor steps back from the serpent's body, and he manages only 9 steps before he falls, the number emphasized as if the tradition wants you to count them, to watch the distance he can still claim before the cost reaches him completely. The defender reaches the end of his function, and there is no rescue waiting off stage, because the story is not interested in softening the truth it has been preparing. Some jobs end when the world ends, and some strengths are designed to be spent entirely. If Thor's power has been the power of holding, then Ragnarök is the moment the myth admits that holding is not eternal. The value lies in what was preserved along the way, in the seasons gained, in the roads kept open, in the households that remained intact for as long as they could. Thor's death does not erase his presence from human life, and that is another place where the evidence becomes quietly compelling. Long before modern retellings turned him into spectacle, his name was already woven into the landscape through place names, and into language through the weekday that still carries his echo. Those traces do not prove belief in a neat, measurable way, but they do suggest a depth of cultural memory that outlasted individual stories. Archaeology strengthens the sense that Thor belonged close to ordinary life. The small hammer pendants found across Scandinavia, often in graves, imply a symbol carried daily rather than reserved for rare occasions. Many of these objects are not extravagant, and that matters because it hints that the hammer was not only a badge of status. It functioned as reassurance, a portable sign that protection was something you could carry into travel, work, and uncertainty. When Christianity spread through the north over centuries, the older gods did not simply vanish overnight. Beliefs shift unevenly, practices blend, stories adapt. In later folklore, echoes of Thor's heaviness can survive in strongman figures and tales of force meeting wilderness, even when the explicit divine frame has changed. At the same time, later retellings can strip away the older gravity, turning Thor into an easy emblem of violence or a simplified hero, because simplicity travels well and sells easily. The older figure is harder to flatten. He carries strain, he carries motion, he carries consequence. He is built for a world where the sky can break your plans, and the border between safety and chaos requires constant work. Thor's meaning is not that he dominates forever. His meaning is that he shows up where pressure gathers, and he keeps showing up until showing up is no longer possible. And when thunder rolls, when the air shakes and the ground answers, there is still a part of the old imagination that hears it as presence moving with purpose, as if the world, for a moment, remembers what it felt like to believe that strength could hold the line for one more night.